I can speak for a long time about. So, do I have to tell you why components as a concept are a good thing? Everyone understands that it's a great idea, right, to have a standard way of building reusable bits of code that you can give to someone else. They don't have to understand how it works, they just have to understand what the API is. They drop it in their page, it does stuff, they configure it, right? We all understand that component-based development is really good, and we've done it for years, right? I mean, throughout my career at Oracle and before, we've been through many, many technologies that are component-based, be they Visual Basic back in the day, or through JSF and so on. These are all component-based. The nice thing about the component, of course, is this aspect of shareability, and this is what gets me excited, is the idea of an ecosystem. The idea that one person's work or one team's work can be spread throughout, throughout a company or throughout the world. One of the big things we have at Oracle is preventing teams from redoing the same thing again and again and again. Because it's such a huge company, we've got thousands and thousands of developers, and I can't tell you how many rich text editor controls people have tried to build in JavaScript. Right? We could have a single component that does that. Wouldn't that save a lot of time? So the idea of having an ecosystem where we can share components, and it's not going to be difficult for someone to use one of those components is really key. So that's what gets me excited. So, now we're in the world at the moment of, a lot of new application development is done on the client using JavaScript, HTML, and CSS as technologies. But as a technology, that's got a fundamental problem in that there really has been no way of layering on the concept of a proper component model on top of HTML. And we've had, there are lots of attempts and approaches to doing this. At one extreme, you can think of server-side frameworks like Java Server Faces, ADF. Those are providing a component model on top of HTML. They happen to be doing a lot of it on the server side, but that's fundamentally what they do. But those are difficult frameworks to use. They need a lot of back-end infrastructure. So we've been in this bit of a mess where we have a lot of people wanting to develop in HTML, but there's just too many ways to choose. And so, what we've been looking towards is, can we achieve some kind of standardization? So, that's the idea. We want to give developers the ability, and I say we in the general sense, not in the Oracle sense, but in the community sense. We want to give developers the opportunity to create their own custom HTML tags that do things. Not to do magic, but just simple HTML tags, right? And that should encapsulate all of the functionality. That's what we're talking about. So when I talk about a web component, I'm talking about a custom HTML element that your browser will understand. Not that I have to layer on all sorts of JavaScript libraries to use and do magic and expect special placeholders and all of the things that have to happen today, but rather just a tag that the browser will know what to do with it and interpret it correctly. And will hopefully work across all browsers, but that's another issue. So if we look at component-like systems today, because we are still in this situation where there is not really any proper way of doing this apart from the standard that's growing that I'll talk about, these are the kind of issues we can run into. So I've got here a very simple example. Sorry, I can't point to all the screens at once, so I'll point to this one. A simple example, imagine that this div here represents a component. So I'm trying to provide a reusable component for people to use. And if you do a lot of JavaScript work, you'll be very used to this, right? You get told, oh, put an element on the page and give it this style marker, or give it this ID, and I'll transform it into this magic component. A map will appear here, or a diagram or whatever. So this is commonly the kind of stuff you have. And then maybe, when you actually run the page, things happen inside of that element. Elements, a DOM subtree gets injected, and that's your component. And this has a few fundamental problems today. So the first problem is one of there's no namespacing, right? So we've got our logical component, and that logical component in it has created a DOM element with an ID of I1, but there's no concept that, oh, actually, there's already an I1 in my page. You've got a collision, and that's a bad thing, right? So you have to be pretty careful as a component author to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's the first problem, and it's a major one. The second problem is one of style isolation. Right? If I want to have styling associated with my component in the page, then it's very likely that there's no ring fence, there's no firewall around my component. So if I do something stupid like redefine H1, the style of H1, that's going to leak into the page. And so I'll end up with a situation where something my component does changes the page of the consumer outside of my component. And that's a bad thing as well. Right? All sorts of side effects that we don't want. And there are other similar things, right? We've got a single JavaScript namespace, so if I create an object, attached to the window, oh, and there's already an object with that name, things can go wrong. So there's all sorts of problems that are created by the way we do components today, because there's no formal understanding on the part of the browser to make that happen. And there's no correct way, as I said, there's 101 different frameworks to do this. So we know we want some kind of standardization, and that's where the Web Components project comes in. And this has grown out of the Polymer project. And the idea here is there's several parts of this that need to be kind of combined to make a proper component model. And these are all being worked into the HTML spec as we speak. So the place to go to really learn more about this and kind of do web components natively, I'll talk about browser support in a second, is to go to webcomponents.org. And specifically, if you go to the /introduction page, you'll get a very good overview of all of the parts that are required to make this work. And you can use Polymer to create your own component in code and see what it looks like. However, what you could also do is just use Jet, where we've made it really easy to do. But we'll come on to that in a second. So I don't want to spend too long on this because we've only got 45 minutes rather than the usual hour, and you can go away and look at it. But let's look very, very quickly at the key parts of this whole set of specifications that contribute towards proper components inside HTML. The key one is this thing called custom elements. And so this is the ability to add your own tag to the HTML language. And that's the key one, right? So the idea is if you want to have my custom toolbar button or my custom button, you can do that. There are some naming rules because we want to make sure that any component that you add to HTML doesn't collide with a new HTML element that the base specification puts in. And at Oracle, we've introduced our own naming rules. So you'll find every component that comes out of Oracle will be prefixed with OJ-, right? Because they're all related to Oracle Jet. Those are ours. There is no governing body that says this is your namespace, unfortunately. So you're going to have to invent your own standards. But I would recommend you come up with that very early on in your life cycle if you're starting to build your own components. Because otherwise you will get into a real mess. You'll start colliding with other people and so on. Because obviously a component of a given name can only be registered once in the browser at any one point in time. You can't have competing components trying to use the same element name. Okay. There's two types of elements you can create. There are what we call autonomous components, which is a custom tag like my custom button. And they're also extension, where you can take an existing HTML element type like button and add additional functionality. I don't care about extension types, they're not interesting. What more can you do to a button, really? You know, you can add a few little bits, but it's not that exciting. Autonomous elements are the really interesting thing because we can have components that are really simple or components that are super complicated. So because these things are just based on the core HTML element, they will get all of the features that a basic HTML element gets. So by, for free, you get an ID, a title, a style, all of those standard attributes that every HTML element has, you'll get in your autonomous elements as well. And then, as we'll see, you add your own attributes on top of that. Right. As I mentioned, there's some naming rules as well. So custom elements are the first and the most important part of the web component specification. The second part, which again is very important from a functional perspective, though you don't really see it, is this thing called Shadow DOM. So this is all to do with the encapsulation of what's inside your component, hiding your component implementation from the rest of the page. So your styles don't leak out, so your HTML DOM subtree is hidden away and can't be directly hacked by the consumer of the component. If you're really interested, you can go into Chrome today, and there's a developer option to switch on Shadow DOM, and you can see how Chrome uses Shadow DOM for some of its own component implementations. Things like drop-down lists in Chrome are actually using this functionality behind the scenes. So this is technical. You don't have to really understand it. Just be aware there's this idea that we're drawing a boundary around the component so the component can't leak out and you can't get in. The only way to talk to the component is through the element API, the formal API of the component. So Shadow DOM is an important part. It does define one very important thing, a thing called slotting, and I've got a slide on slotting in a second. HTML imports, it's formally part of the picture. It's just a way of being able to attach a fragment of HTML to a page without interpreting it. It may actually never be implemented. There's some debate as to whether it's really that useful or important, because there are other ways of doing the same thing. So we'll ignore that. Say the Mozilla Foundation have indicated that Firefox will never implement HTML imports. So even if Chrome does it, Firefox won't. So it's not important really. It's not vital rather for the spec. So we'll just skip over it. It's there. HTML templates, we're already using these inside of Jet just for other purposes, but templates are just a way, again, of having a fragment of HTML which is embedded within your page but not interpreted. And we use these in Jet, for example, whenever we're stamping out a tree or a list view, we've got a template for what each row should look like, so you can substitute in the right values. So templates are an important part of what has to happen inside of a component. And we'll kind of see what that looks like in terms of a web component implemented in Oracle Jet in a moment. But slots, let's talk about slots. So who here is familiar with Java Server Faces or ADF? Quite a lot of you, okay. So in ADF, you're familiar with a thing called facets? Yeah? Yeah. So if you are, you'll understand already what a slot is. A slot is just like a facet. It's a name child. So here's the problem that's been solved, right? I've got a component, and it's a complex component, like a toolbar, so it's going to put out lots of bits of UI. The chances of that being perfect for what every use case are quite limited. I want to make it extensible. I want the consumers of my component to be able to add in some extra bits, maybe some extra toolbar buttons. And slotting allows me to do that. So I can basically say, okay, I'm going to output my standard toolbar, but then here's a space for you to add your own buttons as well. And that's what a slot is. It's a way of indicating the space. So what we say is, it's for external content that is unknown ahead of time. The component author doesn't know what's going to be here. You're making it available. So it's a very important part of the API. And in this case, we've got a thing called the default slot. So just the children of a component are in the default slot. They are available, and the component can choose to lay them out wherever it wants them. And the nice thing here is you can have multiple slots. So you can start to define slots as an API, where you are indicating the use of a slot by its function. Not where it's going to go, that's up to the component author, but you're telling the consumer, hey, right, you can put, if you put stuff or assign stuff